years I've spent using Linux has led me to experiment with nearly every music production software there is available for the platform. As somebody who loves the Linux OS, it can sometimes be frustrating finding the software to do what you want. The aim of this video is to help those new to this practice, and hopefully will save them some time. I also want to make it clear that I do not wish to seem like I am disrespecting any of these programs, especially the free and open source ones. I know a lot of work goes into every piece of software on this list, and I have a great admiration and respect for all of the developers who spend their time and energy working on these. That being said, I am going to voice my opinions of the software because I think this will be helpful to the end users and possibly for the developers as well. So let's get started. Let's first talk about Rosegarden. This program has been around for a really long time, and at first glance it looks pretty amazing. The UI is very logical, it's easy to navigate, looks pleasing, and seems to have a lot of features such as in-depth MIDI editing, musical score features, audio recording, jack support, FX processing, and more. In the past, I never had much luck with Rosegarden. It would seem to crash within minutes or even seconds of using it, so I pretty much gave up on it for several years until just recently when I decided to make this video. Many times in the world of Linux, if something doesn't work as well as you'd like it to, just wait a year or so and check it out again. Many times the problems will be gone or at least improved upon. So, that being in mind, I fired up Jack and Rosegarden and hooked up a MIDI channel with a software synth. I hit record and it recorded. I was pretty excited at first, but then I tried to really get to work and started running into some trouble. My first big problem was when I clicked the metronome symbol and heard nothing. Investigating the problem, it turns out that Rosegarden doesn't actually have its own click, but rather relies on an external program such as Nady to generate a click sound. After about 10 minutes of fiddling, I was able to get Nady to function as a click track, so I hit record and tried again. I recorded the track, which seemed to go well, but upon playback I noticed something pretty strange. The click was a full beat out of sync with the grid in Rosegarden. I found this to be a bit odd and thought this must be some kind of latency issue, so I examined my Jack settings and used the Jack I/O delay program to measure my latency of my audio interface, and then entered the recommended settings into QJack control configuration. If you don't know what any of this means, this is probably a video that I'll have to do at some other time. But I'm just going to skip over all that for now because I want to get back to the topic at hand. Anyway, to make a long story short, my latency adjustments seemed to do nothing. And then I started to think maybe there's a latency adjustment within Rosegarden. So, investigating this online in forums and the Rosegarden page, I was able to determine that Rosegarden doesn't have a latency compensation feature. So I did some more digging, and it turns out the horrible off-time click really wasn't due to Rosegarden after all, but instead it was a problem of timidity. I guess timidity is pretty old and doesn't play well with Jack or ALSA or Pulse Audio or anything really. So the way around this is to fire up QSynth, which is a fluid synth front end, and with the GM sound font loaded you can assign this as a metronome, then the click actually does sound on time. I don't really understand why the developers of Rosegarden decided to rely on an external program to generate click sounds to begin with. It's quite possible that there's a technical reason in the coding that I just don't understand, but for an end user like me, it just seems strange and it's an extra step I need to go through to start recording. Anyway, I got the click up and running and I thought I'd test the whole thing out with recording both audio and MIDI. I plugged in my bass and recorded a simple bass track. Upon playback, I noticed the track I just recorded was very slightly out of sync with the click. This time, there was no doubt that this was a latency issue with my audio interface, which is about 23 milliseconds at its current settings. I double-checked my latency settings in QJack control that I set up earlier with Jack I/O delay, but they checked out, and everything was set up the way it should be. So apparently Rosegarden not only doesn't have its own latency compensation feature, but also fails to read the latency compensation settings from QJack control as well. This is very troublesome and an unfortunate thing since it makes recording audio very, very difficult. Difficult, but not impossible. You see, there's this little utility plugin made by Steve Harris called Artificial Latency that allows you to correct timing problems. Though it didn't seem to have any rhyme or reason to the settings I ended up having to use to make it sound on time. I tried setting the plugin to correspond with the settings that Jack I/O delay suggested, but that didn't work, so I just set it by ear, which ended up being around 100 milliseconds to make it sound on time. Which is strange, but it worked. However, it was a pain in the ass to set up, and it would be really hard to do this every time you wanted to record a track. So unless Rosegarden gets its own latency compensation feature, I think recording audio with it is just far too difficult at this time. The track view of Rosegarden also leaves much to be desired. Unless I'm just completely missing something, I just couldn't find a way to make the tracks taller. A quick, though not terribly thorough, Google search turned up nothing as well on this subject, nor can you really even edit waves within Rosegarden. You can do very basic split, cut, copy, and paste, but if you right-click the wave and select Edit, it opens it up in your default wave editor. In my case, this is Audacity. So, essentially, I really wouldn't recommend using Rosegarden for audio. Midi, on the other hand, is quite doable, and depending on what your focus is, it may end up being pretty good for you. The fact that it has a built-in score editor is very nice, but one odd thing I noticed when recording Midi, then opening up the Midi track in the score editor, it records all of the Midi note-off signals as rests in the score. This seems pretty odd to me, and I don't think if you were really scoring the music out, you'd actually write it like this. I could be wrong, my music notation skills are weak at best, but it just doesn't look right to me. The Midi matrix editor, on the other hand, though, is very nice. Actually, it's one of the better I've seen in Linux. It has robust quantization, transpose, velocity, and CC editing features, plus just looks really nice and is super easy to use. This is where Rosegarden really excels. So if you're working mainly in MIDI and notation, Rosegarden may be for you. I personally have found it pretty useful for creating and editing MIDI files for drum lessons, then exporting those files to MuseScore for compiling print drum lessons. LMMS, which stands for Linux Multimedia Studio, really isn't multimedia at all, and it's not just for Linux either, but it's still a pretty cool program. It's basically a loop-based MIDI sequencer that has a pretty minimal and a little bit clunky interface that relies a little bit too heavily on middle clicking for deleting notes in the song editor, which is kind of a pain in the butt since no laptops really have 3-button mice these days, and I don't really want to find a 3-button mouse to plug into my laptop every time I want to use LMMS. You can kind of get around this from right-clicking and selecting delete rather than clicking the middle mouse button, so it's not that big a deal. However, like Rosegarden, it also has some metronome issues. There's no way to play a click when just auditioning a track. In fact, the only way to play a click is when recording a MIDI track with nothing else playing in the background. Why? Why would you want this? However, unlike Timidity, the click track is actually on time, and it runs great with Jack, and I can get latency pretty low on it. Editing can be a bit of a pain, and it's a little bit wonky due to the middle clicking thing. There's no transpose buttons, moving MIDI notes around is a little bit weird, quantize is incredibly basic or pretty much non-existent, and there's no tempo track. I know that all sounds pretty bad, but despite all of that, there's a lot of great things about LMMS. Once you get past all its quirks, the loop-based interface is pretty fast and honestly pretty fun, and has the power to make some quality sounding work. It's kind of similar to old versions of FL Studio where you create patterns and paint those patterns into a basic song editor. The UI is clean and easy to navigate. It supports Jack and has amazing built-in samplers, software synths, and an incredible SF2 sound font player, and there's a ton of included samples and sounds which allow you to make great sounding work pretty much right out of the box. You can use a Midi controller or just the keyboard on your computer. I've produced some great sounding tracks with nothing but a Chromebook running Ubuntu and LMMS. Also, if you use the full Wine ASIO version, you can even run almost all Windows VST plugins with it. This is quite an amazing feature, and when you get it working, you have literally thousands of new options at your fingertips. The most current version also allows you to export multi-track audio. So this means if you sequenced a 16-track MIDI song, you can export every track individually as audio, then dump them into a multi-track recorder and mix them there, like something like Ardour or Mixbus. This is what I personally do quite often. I find myself using LMMS a lot. It has the capability of creating real quality sounding work, but still can improve in several ways. One of my biggest pet peeves with this program is its extremely limited metronome. There's no tempo track feature, no way to change time signatures mid-song, and as I mentioned before, no way to just practice to a click. My way around this is I often just create a click track in one of the patterns and use that instead. But kind of like Rosegarden, why is this not the first order of business for the developers of LMMS? A good click or metronome is an absolutely essential feature, and honestly a very basic one. It was there on the earliest DAWs running on the oldest computers, so I'm not sure how this is not something that is given higher attention. Next we have Ardour. Ardour is another full DAW that started out as an audio-only multi-track system, but has since evolved into having a pretty robust MIDI sequencer. It also features full Linux plugin support of LADSPAs, LV2s, DSSI, and VST for Linux. I've been checking out this program for a pretty long time, and they have pretty active development. Updates come out pretty often, and it has a lot of features. The UI is pretty pleasing and reminds me of Pro Tools a little bit. Since version 3, there's been MIDI support, but even with Ardour 2, you could use an external MIDI editor like Seek24 and sync them all together with Jack. This works pretty well, and honestly I kind of prefer this method compared to using Ardour's built-in MIDI functions. The reason for that is I'm not really crazy about the way Ardour handles MIDI. I find the editing to be a little bit cumbersome, and copying and pasting always seems to do weird things for me. Quantizing never seems to do what I want it to do. Editing MIDI in general seems to be far too time-consuming for me. There's no way to open up the MIDI clip in a second window for editing, so you basically have to zoom in on the timeline and edit it there. True, you can zoom in enough to work, but this seems slow and annoying to me. I'd rather just be able to double-click the MIDI clip and have it open it up in another window, like Cubase. Also, Ardour seems to be still pretty unstable and crashes fairly often. True, everything crashes sometimes, but I have it happen to me more on Ardour than others. Though it's not enough to cause serious problems, and this is by all means pretty excellent software. If you like Ardour, Harrison Mixbus is based on Ardour and shares a lot of its code. However, Mixbus is like Ardour on steroids. Take everything good about Ardour and Mixbus has it, but in addition to that, it's more stable and has a highly enhanced virtual mixer that features parametric EQs, analog-style compressor, gate, and limiters on every channel, plus a dedicated multi-channel bus section that you can easily route audio to it with the click of a button. The audio quality of Mixbus is nothing short of amazing. Some of the nicest and most powerful sounding drum sounds I've ever done have been done in Mixbus. For recording multi-track audio, I think this is the nicest sounding DAW I've ever heard. It really does have a character very similar to an old analog console, and I find myself barely having to use any external effects in my mixes because the EQs, buses, limiters, and compressors are all so amazingly good. The downside is MIDI. Though it works, it shares a lot of the same annoyances as Ardour. This is a bit of a shame, but I know both Ardour and Mixbus will have this fixed in the very near future. Both have highly active development, and I know Mixbus has stated several times that MIDI is still in infant stages. If you were going to get by with just one DAW in your Linux system, Mixbus or Ardour would be the one. I would lean more towards Mixbus, just because I think it sounds so good. But who wants just one DAW anyways? Not me. Both Ardour and Mixbus have latency compensation features. Ardour isn't built in, but if you use the Jack I/O delay program that I was talking about earlier and enter that into QJack control, it does seem to work. For Mixbus, there's this nifty little tool that allows you to measure your latency right as you open up your project, and then you can enter in the recommended settings by the program, which is essentially, I think, just Jack I/O delay as well, but just integrated right into Mixbus. Either way, they both seem to work just fine when you overdub parts, and everything sounds on time to me when I do it. Oh yeah, there's a real tempo track on both of these programs, as well as a full-featured metronome. So you can actually change tempos and time signatures within the song, and you can program multiple ones as you go along. Overall, both programs are very good, and I highly recommend using either one or both. Next on my list is EnergyXT. This is another full-featured DAW that features audio and MIDI sequencing, plug-in support, and some unique features that are similar to, but not exactly like Ableton Live. If you're looking to work in MIDI, EnergyXT probably has the nicest UI and best MIDI editing features of the bunch. It's very similar to the MIDI editing done in Cubase, which if you've ever done, you know of its ease and professional features. It has full-featured editing with transpose, auto-quantize, duplicating, looping, and drag-and-drop features, which allows you to save MIDI clips as loops and quickly drag them back into the project anywhere or even in other projects. It can do the same with audio too. This is a very cool feature, and this is some of the kind of thing that reminds me a little bit of Ableton. There's also a great arrangement track you can assign MIDI keys to trigger arrangements on the fly or for live performance. This would be very useful for DJs or as a nice way to audition different arrangements. You can also save multiple arrangements of the same song. Its drawbacks are when it comes to using Jack. It will work, but not out of the box. You have to download the source code for the Jack driver and then build it yourself, and then replace it in the program folder. I found this not really working for me, but luckily I found a pre-built .deb file that did the trick. Once I got Jack up and running, I ran into a couple other drawbacks. One is EnergyXT will only use VSTs, so there's no using LADSPAs or DSSIs. Also, I wanted to use some of my sound fonts that I talked about earlier in QSynth, so I thought I'd just connect it in Jack via the MIDI out of EnergyXT, but unfortunately the Jack driver doesn't provide a MIDI out. Researching it online, I was able to determine that this used to be achieved with a VST plugin which provided MIDI output called midiout.so. However, all of the links to this seem to be dead. I tried Googling for it for about an hour and I still just couldn't find it anywhere. Thankfully, the provided synths that come with EnergyXT sound quite excellent, so there's plenty there to play with. Plus, the amount of VSTs for Linux these days is actually much higher than I thought. One other drawback, though, is there doesn't seem to be any way to connect more than 2 audio inputs in EnergyXT, at least with the Jack driver. I'm not sure about the regular one. I'm also not sure if this is the case in the Windows version of EnergyXT, but on my system I just could not get any more than 2 to connect. A good thing, though, like LMMS, EnergyXT also has multi-channel export. So if you want to compose a multi-channel MIDI song and then export it to stems, to overdub and mix in Mixbus or something like that, you can easily do this. But another drawback is that there's no MIDI sync or Jack transport feature. Even with all of its flaws, EnergyXT is still one of my favorites of this bunch. I would love to see it get a little more attention from the developer and from people in general. Maybe if enough people purchased it, it would kick them back into action. One more drawback is that it's again with this metronome thing. Though EnergyXT does have a pretty good metronome as far as functionality, it just doesn't have any accents on the beat. So basically it's one constant click with no marker for the 1, or where the beat turns around. You really don't have that. Overall, EnergyXT is a blast to use. It sounds great. You could do audio and MIDI. It does have latency compensation, which is kind of minimal, but it works. And it's just a cool program. So that's all I'm going to do for now. Maybe I'll do a part 2 of this video at some point, but I just wanted to quickly mention that before I go, after I started the beginning of this video, I actually spent quite a bit more time working with Rosegarden, and eventually I really started to like that software. The MIDI editing and just MIDI recording and the way that it works with QSynth and Jack, I just think that it's a really, really great program. True, the latency compensation or lack of latency compensation feature does make it a little bit challenging to record audio, but I actually have been able to do it pretty successfully. And if you look at some of my other videos that I've posted recently before this one, you'll see that I even recorded some drums in there. And there is a way to get it to sync up, not by itself, but it's not too difficult to do, and I think I will do a tutorial on that as well once I get done with this one. Another quick software that I wanted to mention was QTractor, and this one is really, really interesting, and I haven't had enough time to really play with it to include it in this video, so I just wanted to mention it very quickly. I actually didn't even know about it until I started researching for this video, and downloaded and installed it and watched a few videos on YouTube, and it really looks cool. Like, it really has a clean layout, and I think it's probably a very, very good program, but I just haven't played with it. So also, no disrespect to the developers, as I mentioned before. They're all incredible, and all of this software, I know tons and tons of work goes into all of this stuff, and you know, my criticisms were just from the end user point of view, and you know, I don't mean anything by it. You know, I will of course always be checking out this software, and I recommend everybody try everything on here, and you know, help out any way that they can, donate, buy the software, do whatever they can to help development of Linux programs, because you know, those of us that like to use Linux as opposed to Mac OS and Windows, you know, we have to stick together and support each other, you know, because like there's not a lot of stuff out there. Well, actually there is a lot of stuff out there, but it's a little bit more, you know, a little bit loosely or a little less organized. So, you know, you don't just buy a computer and put Ableton on it like you do with Mac or Windows, and like that's all you use. You know, there's nothing wrong with that, but you know, we like to do things a little bit differently in the Linux world. So I don't know what else. That's pretty much it. Subscribe, and thanks for watching my videos, and thanks for watching this video. Hopefully you found it educational and informative, and if you want to leave a comment or question or anything like that, just post it down below. Thanks, and have a great day.